what we want to do today, we were broadly talking about what sponsorship going to be like post-pandemic. And we have a pretty broad definition of sponsorship. It's not just official sponsor of something. It's somebody that's involved with an event which is got a significant commitment required in terms of being there and being present. And there's also, in all likelihood, a great associative value. So we're breaking this into two pieces today. We're going to talk about two big events, two signature events that happened recently with some esteemed experts in that area. And then we're going to talk about some events that are coming down the road. We're very fortunate to have with us today Norris Scott, who is a senior vice president at FuturesSport at Octagon. He was a VP of Analytics and Insights at NASCAR, formerly at both ESPN, NFL, ABC Sports, and he had a great focus on sponsorship sales for the NFL, college football, and the Triple Crown. Dan Donnelly is with us today. Dan, as you may recall, joined us when we were in person last February, and I think he was in his post-big event stress change at that point because he had just gone through the Super Bowl last year with Fox, and he's got a great media eye for what has happened. So we're curious to see what Dan thinks about the just completed Super Bowl, knowing what he knows from last year. He was also EVP Managing Director at Starcom Media Vest, and he was the media lead for Budweiser. Well, we're going to talk about Budweiser today. And Ray Katz, who I mentioned on the name, image, and likeness. Ray is the co-founder and COO of Collegiate Sports Management Group. He's an adjunct professor of sports business at Columbia, and he's had leadership roles working for the NFL, working for things like the Football Network. He worked for both the MSG and the Knicks and Rangers, and he's got sufficient agency experience from early in his career. And Ray's got tremendous sports media experience from his time at OMD. So, gentlemen, welcome and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
So, Dan, I'm sure you get as many questions as I do, or probably even more about the Super Bowl. Given that you knew every one of the 82 or whatever it was commercials that ran in Super Bowl 54 last year, as you watched the game a couple weeks ago in Tampa, what did you see that was maybe different from last year, and what might have kind of surprised you in terms of what you saw in terms of the lineup of advertisers and their prominence within the game?
Yeah, well, it's interesting for a number of reasons. First of all, sitting on my couch with my family, I haven't done that for a Super Bowl in quite some time. So that was a unique experience. But what was interesting to us last year, I think you all know, you read about, we sold out the Super Bowl, earlier than had been done in years past. And one of the reasons why we did is I think a lot of marketers, were ready to be marketers around the Super Bowl. So it wasn't just advertising in the game itself, but it was really more of an integrated marketing approach. There were some brands that really created intricate, complex campaigns. I'm going to use Tide as an example, and then I'll pivot to this year. Like Tide last year, and they had been doing this for a few years, but if you remember back to the Stains Can Wait campaign, we were talking to them for at least 6, maybe even 9 months before the game even happened, because they needed to know where they could air in the game. They actually incorporated the Bud Night into their creative campaign. They integrated our Masked Singer program in there. They also had the Pepsi halftime integrated within their spot. So it was very complex, took a lot of planning. There's others that I could talk about last year in terms of image marketers. But this year, I found as I was watching, they were very practical, very functional, very timely, right? So I rattled down some of the ones that I took note of is just Logitech and webcams and DoorDash and Uber Eats and Indeed with all the jobs posting, Scott's Lawn Care, Oatly, no cow milk, right? People are drinking more milk. They're home for breakfast. They're consuming more milk. So what a great opportunity for a product like that to come in, right? best foods and Hellmann's, right? Depending on where you live in the country, right? Depending on best foods or Hellmann's, but leftover food in the fridge. That was another spot that was very functional. Macari, right? Cleaning out your closets and everything and getting into the marketplace. Vroom, shopping for a car and not going into Bass Pro Shops, right? Rocket Mortgage, I thought was another interesting, because Rocket Mortgage, and they won the ad meter, and personally, I think rightfully so, because there was a very functional, very timely message, but they also were able to kind of create this fun, and yeah, Tracy Morgan doesn't hurt, but they created more of a fun campaign around a very specific message. So that's the biggest difference that I saw, more practical versus image and, you know, sort of high level storytelling last year versus this year.
So when you and I were chatting about this in preparation for the day, we were talking about categories that didn't seem to be as visible this time around. And, you know, I certainly remember 20 plus autos being in the game a few years back. And, I talked to somebody in the auto business that didn't actually want to be in the game, but basically said, I'd be skewered by my dealers if I wasn't in the game, right? Has that dynamic changed? And is that because of the pandemic or other related issues? Or how do you see that from your perspective?
Yeah, so I will tell you, I was a little surprised that there weren't more autos based on what we were seeing week in and week out in our NFL games. Because you think about it, Sunday afternoon, our America's Game of the Week, those aren't cheap units either, right? And so there was a lot of autos there, but they chose not to be in the Super Bowl. And it surprised me because I thought they would want to get their message especially about electric vehicles, right? Mm-hmm. They started seeding that even last year in our game. Hummer was a big one last year in our game. And I think personally they'll come back next year. I'm sure there was plenty of economics in that decision making. Mm-hmm. I think it was also supply chain challenges in that decision. To your point about, how many cars are they selling right now versus the long term, and how many cars they're confident they're going to sell in the future. So I think all those things factored in. We were very fortunate last year because you're right. We had a lot of autos in there, and this year not as much.
Great. Let's turn to Norris for a second. So Norris, with your great experience and breadth of experience across the sponsorship space, what stood out to you about just completed Super Bowl 55?
A lot. I mean, there's so much to talk about. I think, to Dan's point and your point about it just being a different game in terms of the creative and the advertisers that were present, it definitely felt different, right? Because we had as Dan mentioned, it's such a diversity of the types of advertisers as opposed to your typical beers, autos, and QSRs taking up the majority of the game. So I think that stood out to me. As we've seen in the last few years, the amount of advertisers previewing their ads on social media before the game was also pretty heavy. And I think there's great debate on the value, pros and cons on the value of that. It's definitely, something now that has to be considered though. One of the things I read recently was the Alexa Amazon ad had over 115 million total views on social in and around the Super Bowl for their ad, and 77 million of those views came from YouTube alone. So those are big numbers and really speak to just how the Super Bowl advertising strategy has changed over the years.
So to that point, there are a couple different philosophies out there about, should you be doing the previews of your Super Bowl spot or should you wait? Ray, if you don't mind me putting that question to you, what's your kind of thought of the pros and cons of doing the preview?
Well, I think the pros of doing the preview for an individual brand is that they're going to get more views if they have great creative. A number of years ago, I want to say Australian tourism got 98 million views. When you get to a number like that and you start to look at the video value of that, it starts to be, $1.5 million, $2 million of value. That starts to work. But then the bottom of the top 10, and I just remember this because I teach it at Columbia and we discussed it, the bottom of that starts to be more like 300,000. The bottom of the top 10. Now, when you get beyond that, how much are you diluting the value of your $5.5 million reported ad this year in terms of engagement and viewership? And let alone anyone from number 11 to number 70, they're just not adding that much value. So in sum, I think it makes the whole overall ecosystem a little less valuable. So to me, that's the negative.
Dan, Norris, what do you think of that?
So I can chime in. One thing that's interesting, right, is that when you're a Super Bowl advertiser, all of those views before, now you could also amplify it with some paid media, but all of those views you're getting are because you're a Super Bowl advertiser and everyone wants to see your spot. So it's earned, right? Purely, call it free of charge. I know you got to produce an amazing commercial to get more views, but that is earned media. So what in the past, it depends on your objective, right? If you want to get that many views, then go for it. But what we've done, like Coca-Cola, for example, we've done teasers, right? Sort of like movie trailers. You put a teaser out there for 15 seconds and you get people to entice them to watch the game itself for like the premiere. And then coming out, you might even have longer form, right, on the Monday after the game. So, but again, that takes more time, more strategy, more money, right? You got to edit things. So it just depends on what your objective is. If it's straight views, the Super Bowl is the best for that.
Norris, what do you think?
Look, totally agree. And when done right, as Ray articulates, the value can just grow exponentially so much more. I think actually on the other spectrum of all of that, I think we also saw a few advertisers this year who didn't create new creative. And it very much felt like they got the call the day before, hey, we've got an open slot. Let's put an ad that you've been running for the last 6 months into the game. And as someone, in this business, it just felt, I don't know, you could just tell they softball it in. And I almost think to a degree that to some degree can backfire on you, just given the prominence and the expectation that if you're going to be in the game that you have, specific creative.
Well, so we talked about it a little bit in our preparation for today, but I wanted to bring up the beer example, right? So Dan, I know you've got Anheuser-Busch experience and specifically Budweiser. For many, many years, Budweiser was position 1A in the pod. So the first commercial in the game, the first thing you're going to see is Budweiser. They still have commitments in the game, but they gave up that position. And we've always debated how much more that position should be worth, because you've got an entire audience that has been trained to focus on the advertising, because maybe they're going to be in some sort of ad meter, but even if they're not, their friends, the conversation around the real or virtual water cooler the next day is going to be, which spots did you like best? This year, it was curious to me, and like you, I've been fortunate to go to a lot of games, so I watched this one a little more closely at home. It was surprising, at least in New York, to see not just Anheuser-Busch products there, but to see Sam Adams there, actually making fun of Anheuser-Busch by the Clydesdales running wild, and also Corona being there. And to Norris's point, they were running a spot that they've run for some time with Snoop Dogg and Bad Bunny in it, having a conversation with a seashell on the beach. So if you could comment a little bit on what seems to be the erosion of Bud's exclusivity, at least in the New York market. I know you could always do that in the past, buy locally around it, but it just seemed a heck of a lot more noticeable this year, perhaps because the creative messaging on the part of the competitors was pretty good.
Yeah, I think it was a couple of things. The competitors, I think Sam Adams took advantage of that, and Budweiser, their flagship brand, not being in the game, also is a factor. So it's been a long time since I've been with the company, and the company has certainly changed, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Anheuser-Busch back in the day versus ABI now, very different. But I would say this, I'll talk about back in the day. It was more than just a media buy, right? It is Anheuser-Busch had to have exclusivity. They had to have position 1A because it was all about the distribution, the wholesalers, the excitement. Every constituent that either worked at Anheuser-Busch touched the business. It was a pride. And they stood up, and that was the biggest thing that they would do every single year. And the preparation that went into that was the day after, you'd start preparing for the following year because you knew you were there with exclusivity. And Budweiser, and then eventually Bud Light, right, were still the primary lead dogs. I think now, and my observation this year is you could almost take that same observation and apply it to the beer, that the Anheuser-Busch spots that ran versus last year, because not having the flagship, although they had a corporate message, but they're going after who's buying our product and what products are they buying. They're buying Bud Light. They're buying the seltzers. They're not buying the King of Beers anymore, right? So that is the flagship brand. They don't want to get rid of that, but that's pure image. Not as many people are buying that product. So they probably looked at it and said, you know what, let's plow our money into what people are drinking. And then let's spin the fact that we're not going to run in the game because we're going to give back to the community and support vaccines. And hey, that's a corporate thing. And that's a good thing to have for a flagship brand to do. So I think it was strategic and I'll say smart, right? Although not seeing the King of Beers in there was hard for me to even accept.
I think if I saw it correctly, they did actually have a couple billboards for like the non-alcoholic version of Budweiser.
Right.
But what you raise is actually a great marketing version of the chicken and egg question. Did we become less popular and then do less marketing, or do we do less marketing and then become less popular? Right. If you're a brand that's built on leadership and power, and you're not there, and then your brand is diminished, whose fault is that, right? So I'll get off my my high horse on that one. I'd like to jump back for a second to the conversation about previewing the spot, to another conversation that we all had, which was, here we are a couple weeks later, and we've clearly seen some of the creative that ran in the Super Bowl prominently featured since the game. And the game was kind of the launch. The one that comes to mind is the Verizon gaming spot with Samuel L. Jackson. But there are a lot. I mean, the Rocket Mortgage spot has been out there, with a good plan. If you guys were going to talk about the brands that not just the day after, but now a couple weeks after, are kind of top of mind with you that continued marketing, who might they be?
I mean, I would say that the clear winner to me is Rocket Mortgage. I almost find it hard to believe. And look, now there's a lot of movement, right? A lot of people are moving out of New York and they're going up to suburbs or wherever else in the country. They're staying at their second residence in Vermont or Florida. So there's a lot of movement in the mortgage business. And I always look at this the way I used to look at insurance, right? I'm not going to go and get 17 quotes for a mortgage. I'm not going to get 17, or it's not even 17, but 10 quotes for auto insurance. What is the number of brands that you're going to consider in getting your mortgage? Well, you're going to consider your bank, maybe a challenger brand bank. And now I feel Rocket Mortgage is solidly in that brands to be considered position. So if I was going to see something, I'd love to understand, how many options people consider for mortgage. Where was Rocket Mortgage 3 months ago, and where are they today? And I think they've made tremendous inroads.
I agree. And look, I would just add to that too. I think, they did a really good job in their promotion leading up to the Super Bowl in connecting their association to the NFL. And, the three of us are probably a little biased on that given the space we're in, but they did it right. They used the intellectual property. They created this fun, engaging opportunity for fans to get involved. And I think that's going to pay dividends for them, to Ray's point.
So, and I'll piggyback on that because I agree, and then I'll add one more. But the Rocket was interesting because their campaign was very much focused on their message, and then it was all about the squares, right, to draw that association, Norris, to your point, right, and then they hammered home that it's certain versus uncertain, right. So they hammered that point home, and I agree. I thought they did a great job. The other one that I think we'll continue to see a lot of, and Uber Eats, Uber Eats, DoorDash, and even Postmates and buying them. Again, that's an accelerated trend. It already was starting, but an accelerated trend that I think is going to continue well beyond, the pandemic. It's sort of like, Peapod and all the Fresh Direct and Amazon and all those things were already happening. But now they're happening with, and I always equate this to, my mom's in her 70s, right? And now she's like, oh, and I'm like, yeah, you could have been doing this for the past 10 years, but now it's like, oh, I get it. I'm so proud of myself that I know how to do this now. But now you talk about mass, right? Everybody's doing that now.
So let's go kind of forward in terms of what implications we think what we saw in this year's game have. And maybe I should just kind of build off of one of the comments. So the delivery services, if I'm remembering correctly, isn't DoorDash official with the NFL and Uber Eats is not? Am I remembering that correctly? Because the curious thing to me was
Postmates,
and then Uber Eats. Geez, I should know this. Uber Eats bought Postmates.
Yes.
I'm like 90% sure, but yes, thanks for confirmation. So
because it's not clear to me that the official benefited in that regard, right? Whereas if you juxtapose it with Rocket Mortgage, as everybody said, clearly did it right and had a good marketing plan for the entirety of their program, not just the ad that was going to run in the game.
But I would say that, and again, I'll talk about Anheuser-Busch back in the day. Anheuser-Busch was not the official of the NFL, but owned the Super Bowl from a media standpoint. In this case, you look down the roster, and ours last year too, the last few years, it's, there's certainly some official partners that are there, but a lot of them in the Super Bowl are not even using the IP. They're not even tagging their spots at the end as official. It's just their message wants to stand on their own. And hey, there's pros and cons to that, right?
But I fault the way that the agency business has evolved. Right when I started and really learned from the best, Tony at Young and Rubicam, we had the whole egg at Young and Rubicam. So I was an account executive on the Adidas business, negotiating the Madison Square Garden deal, going to the commercial shoot, being part of the promotions, the poster giveaway, and now one hand doesn't know what the other hand is doing. So the creatives, were they even properly briefed what the NFL IP is, what options are at their disposal, is one of my questions and issues, frankly, with where this has gone. And we see that at Collegiate Sports Management Group. We have to go to 7 different people to sell in a big idea. Do you want to own college esports or not? We have to go to 7 people, not one main decision maker.
Yeah.
So let's get back to the question that I fumbled out earlier, but hopefully recovered. Let's talk about next year. So this year is obviously a challenge with the pandemic. Some brands either legitimately or perhaps as a convenient excuse said they weren't going to be involved this year. If vaccines are ramping up, you're seeing, or at least I'm seeing more and more predictions that by the fall, maybe back to school time, things are going to be, whatever normal is at that point in time. But you may still be wearing a mask, but you can do group gatherings, right? How do you think next year looks in terms of the Super Bowl on a couple dimensions? One, are there categories like auto that are going to come back to their kind of peak numbers? 2, are more of the official NFL sponsors going to be visible in and around the game to the points everybody was just making? And 3, what other categories might emerge that have been perhaps a little less represented in the space?
It's a great question. Tony. It's going to be so interesting to see, and I think so much is dependent, obviously, on the economy, as you're citing, and how fans are coming back into sports, and how advertisers and how they're feeling about that, and their budgets. So much up in the air, and I think a lot of it will depend on the NFL, how it returns in September, and the momentum that they can build from that in terms of having another successful season during COVID times. I think you will see some big categories come back a little bit, autos and a few others. I just think to your point, it was probably convenient, or maybe it was very rational in terms of not having discretionary type budgets to not be in this year's Super Bowl. But I think you'll see some categories come back. But I think one last thing I'd say is I think the bigger interesting thing to be watching next year will be what are the new categories that are coming in. To Dan's point, with food delivery or streaming, we're seeing so much happening in the world of streaming because of COVID. Will that really become its own category in Super Bowl just as much as autos? That is not out of the question. So it will be interesting.
Yeah, I would echo that.
Go ahead, guys. Go, Ray.
No, I mean, I would echo that. And I think it's going to be interesting to see what happens with autos. I kind of feel that airlines, if they're nimble and ahead of the curve, they need to be in this, because so many people stopped flying. And if you believe that the amount of air travel is going to get back to normal or some semblance of normal 2 years from now, then there's a lot of market share to be had, because there's a lot of shifting to be had. I know my attitudes have been shifted a great deal based on how Delta handled the situation with COVID versus how American Airlines handled the situation. So someone that really jumps on this, handled it the right way, and communicates that properly moving forward, it's a hell of an opportunity. Also, I think streaming, I agree and echo that. But just to expand on that, we're in the media rights business, so I see what's going on in streaming, and it's a great value for what you spend on a monthly basis, whether it's Netflix or Flow Sports or ESPN. And people have come to realize that they're going to be buying more streaming services than they have, although there are a lot more out there. What are they going to do with Paramount and whatever Amazon, how they evolve Prime and Peacock? So I think that's going to be a great jump ball next year that, with that kind of reach during Super Bowl, you can't beat it to acquire new customers.
Well, we all noted the number of spots that ran for the Paramount streaming service. And I think that to me, that was like the starter's pistol for next year's Super Bowl, because every other streaming service is going to say, oh, it's NBC's game next year. They have Peacock. We better be there.
Yep.
Yeah. The one thing, and I agree with everything you guys have said. The one thing is, when you mentioned, Tony, about NFL official partners, I said it before, I don't think anyone even looks at it that way. Think about it. You got USAA and Nationwide, they don't spend any money there. You got Visa, they don't spend any money there. When P&G does stuff for Tide, there's no association with the IP. When Verizon runs their ad, other than things they can do in the game, they're not talking about the NFL. Anheuser-Busch, right? They don't really talk about the NFL in any of their spots, and they really have. I'm trying to go down the list of Pizza Hut. They're official. They've done some stuff in the pregame, right? But they're not usually like there in a big way. So the officials are not really there in a big way. They're there week in and week out and activating and marketing and things on site, right? And all the things that didn't happen this year, they'll be back to doing that. I'm confident about that. But in terms of the actual commercials running in the game, it's interesting. I don't think they really look at it that way.
So we definitely want to come and talk Daytona in a minute or two, but Frank's indicated there are a number of questions. Frank, do you want to queue up a couple of those for us?
Yeah, why don't we start with a hand raised by Mike Donahue. So, Mike, you should be able to unmute.
Tony, this is you and I have talked a lot about purpose branding and it not really having much financial brand value. The fact that Tide did not make the top 10 this year, even though they had a purpose branding ad, was interesting to me. What do you think?
Well, I guess my take is that I'm not sure that being top 10 was their goal. And if I were doing the marketing for them, I'm not sure that would be the goal. The example that I would use, Mike, from a couple of years ago, Chrysler did a wonderful spot about being imported from Detroit. Yeah. That wasn't on anybody's top list the next day.
Yeah.
But as people started referring to the marketing done in that particular Super Bowl, imported from Detroit was the number one thing. Now, again, my recollection is pretty good of that time. I think they also did a wonderful job of running that message, whether it was at exactly the same length or not, in media following the Super Bowl. And as a longtime believer in the concept of effective frequency, being in the game once is great, and you do get reach there. But good ads, if you pay attention to them, they always build on your knowledge over time when you see them a few times. Perhaps not as many times as they're being distributed now digitally, where there are no frequency caps. But the fact of the matter is that I think the post-marketing matter. I think to me, the message that you're referring to, I think was pretty strong. And I think it's, a marketing plan is not a single airing of something, even if it's in the preeminent property like the Super Bowl. Again, that's kind of my point of view, but happy to debate it with anybody.
Yeah. I saw Dan shake his head. Dan, what do you think?
I agree. I think that's the thing. And it's actually scared some marketers away from the Super Bowl over time, is because they don't want to, I'm not going to rate high in the ad meter. It's like, well, it's not just about the ad meter, right? The ad meter tends to lean toward comedy, humor, surprise and delight, that kind of stuff. And sometimes if you just have a solid message that touches you emotionally, there's not the way the ad meter works is people are usually sitting with a dial. And there's no opportunity to turn the dial because I just got wowed by something, because it's just, wow, that's really cool. That's really cool. And I think that's what happens with the ad meter sometimes. So it shouldn't be judged on that. But
I think to that point, I think if I could add, Tony, the ad to me that did that this year was Toyota. They came into Super Bowl with a very uplifting ad around a Paralympian, and it was had nothing to do about selling a new vehicle that they're bringing out. It was this uplifting moment. And to me, to what you're talking about in terms of taking that different approach and hopefully continuing that campaign, I think that really had high marks.
Thanks. Frank, do we have another question?
Yeah, we actually have one from Don, which was almost exactly on the topic of the impact of the ads in the game. So Don, do you want to ask that? I'll unmute you.
And by the way, that was just luck. Frankly, this is about the excitement level of the game and the effectiveness of the ads. Frankly, personally, I didn't find the game so exciting. I'm not a Tom Brady fan. If I were a Tom Brady fan, I might have been more interested. So I can argue either way. If the game is really exciting, I can imagine people are feeling really good, and so the ads work better. Or if the game is really boring, they're paying more attention to the ads. And I just wondered if any of you guys had opinions on that. The effectiveness of the ads versus the excitement of the game.
Yeah, so I would say, and the guys can build on it or offer a different point of view. I always wanted to be in the first half of the game. I guess that probably shows my age, because I remember many Super Bowl blowouts. And I also remember being at a Super Bowl where we had a spot at the 4-minute point in the first half. And at the start of the fourth quarter, somebody from Fox, before Dan was there, came to me and said, we'll give you a second spot in the fourth quarter for a very attractive rate, shall we say it. The game was actually a sellout, but because the game was a blowout, the advertiser that held that spot was trying desperately to get out of the game, and they were trying to accommodate them. So, it's curious, Don, when you look at the kind of minute-by-minute ratings, in the blowouts, the audience hasn't gone down by as much, but as somebody who believes in engagement, and I very much am in that space, I think what you're citing, I think is very typical with people watching the game. The game's on, you're a little more distracted. Maybe you're paying, some people have made the argument you pay more attention to the ad, but blowouts don't have good associative value, in my opinion.
Absolutely. I would add to that. At NASCAR, we used to measure, the fans, their thoughts on how exciting the race was. Every week we would monitor that. And what we found is you could have the most exciting race on record. And if the driver that the most fans disliked won the race, or in that very last lap, there happened to be, a huge lead. If one of those two things happened, even though it could have been the greatest race ever, fans just gravitated towards that last moment. So that kind of created this cloud on how they would rank or rate the race. So maybe not the best example to the Super Bowl, but point is the competition in the game matters a great deal, obviously on viewership, but also fan sentiment for sure.
On that point, Kevin Richardson would like to have a kind of a follow-up question. Building on this question, how much do you think second half advertisers suffered this year? Thinking particularly of Springsteen Jeep ad, which has just been cleared to go back on air.
I think I'll start it. You guys can jump in. So I would say that there's a couple different issues there. I don't think Springsteen Jeep suffered because of being in the second half, because it certainly created a lot of conversation. They've just gone back on air with that ad, as I understand it, because the charges against Bruce Springsteen related to riding a motorcycle, where his blood alcohol was 0.02, turned out to be dismissed. In this day and age, you have a lot of people that are carrying pitchforks and torches, and brands have to be very aware of being safe. But I think that whole circumstance was not really related to any diminishment of the second half in my mind. My comment to a lot of you folks on this was, I think the name of that spot was The Middle. If I had been naming that spot, I would have called it Common Ground, because I think that's really what the concept was about. And I think it gets to, would have been perhaps diffused some of the commentary that was there. But that's putting on my old creative hat doing that.
Yeah. That's a good point. And the only thing I would say is, if you look at the data, right, normally the Super Bowl start, that 1A position that Bud used to have, it's the lowest rated part of the game every year. Lowest rated part, even with the blowout, it's still the lowest rated, because you got the households using television are the lowest, right? So it builds over time, and then it either goes like this for a good close game, or it kind of goes like that, but it doesn't ever just falls off.
But I would have always paid a premium for position 1A, because in my opinion, the engagement levels were highest there without question, based on everything I've ever seen.
And ratings only tell part of the story. If it's a blowout game, people leave the Super Bowl party, to the extent there is a Super Bowl party, and they get in the car. That doesn't change the rating 1 point.
Right.
And, Nielsen doesn't know who's getting in the car and who's not getting in the car to leave, or getting in a taxi or an Uber.
Oh boy, that's another panel for us.
that's an hour conversation. Frank,
not that I'm disagreeing with you. I'm just saying.
Yeah. Oh, great.
Let me go to Jose Escobar. He's asked, has a question to ask.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes,
we can hear you.
Yeah, Tony, it's not Jose, it's Francisco.
Hey, Francisco, how are you?
Yeah, I wanted to send you a note to congratulate you on the program, but I don't have your current email address, so we'll have to get that later. My question is as follows. Notwithstanding the 1984 infamous ad, and to go back to the last caller who's not that much of a Brady fan, I'm not that much of a fan of Super Bowl ads. I think for the most part, they are not representative of the amount of money that the companies are spending to put them on that day. But my true measure of a really good Super Bowl ad is whether they keep running it after the Super Bowl, right? Forgetting the Apple ad. And you don't really see that many of them. I wouldn't say that more than 50% of them seem to run again. So just want you all to comment on that, because that's just my take. I'm not impressed with Super Bowl ads.
So
Well, so I should, Francisco, great. First of all, great for being here today. Glad to have you. I would say that there are a couple things that have changed my point of view about that over the years, right? I used to advocate for my clients that they were better off advertising in the AFC and the NFC championship games, because on the price value there was enormous relative to the Super Bowl. And those are perennially the second and third biggest audiences during the course of the year from a television standpoint, right? And it's much less expensive, right? But my point of view has changed over time, and it's the factor we were talking about earlier with tremendous pre and during ability to distribute what you're doing. So, as an example, when I was selling sandwiches a few years ago, we were able to get 130 million impressions about a commercial that we were running in the game, where I didn't really want to preview it too much because I didn't want people saying I don't like the spot and all those kind of things, and having to change it. But we basically did that from Friday night to Sunday afternoon before the game. And that the game that year, as I recall, the audience was stated to be 110 million. So you're more than doubling the size of the audience that you're reaching. And that audience has got the two most powerful words. If you talk to anybody in marketing media, they would beg for people to make comments about the Super Bowl, even in September, because as journalists are being paid by clicks, if you put the word Super Bowl in the headline, the likelihood that it's going to be read is greater. It's got a magic appeal that goes far beyond what you think it might be. The other thing I would talk about a little bit is lasting effect. So there is a very well-known technology company in the Pacific Northwest who their head of analytics and I were on a panel prior to the pandemic out on the West Coast. And we were talking about Super Bowl advertising, and they had ran an ad in the Super Bowl that year. And he said to me, and this is a rough approximation of an exact quote. He said to me, "We're amazed. Here it is November. The Super Bowl was in February, and I still got comments coming through on my tracker about us being in a Super Bowl ad." That kind of effect is far beyond even high profile media purchases, right? And, you want the brand effect to linger in a positive way. And his comment, I've heard variations of that from other marketers who've been in the game. And I think that, based on everything I've seen, is true. So the price is enormous, no question. It does require a plan, kind of like we were talking about with Rocket Mortgage. But I would say that, keeping an open mind about it, you can see that there are examples of people who do it very, very well. I think the creative issue this year was a little more complicated by everybody worrying about what the appropriate tone was during the pandemic, right? So the big humor kind of stuff that everybody's going to remember the day after, people didn't really go close to that, right? I mean, kudos to Rocket Mortgage for having Tracy Morgan there and doing something fun, but it was appropriate fun and it was relative to the brand. So it didn't seem out of place. Right. So all of that tonal stuff is kind of hard to deal with, but if you're paying attention, I think you've got a pretty good chance of succeeding. And how much has Rocket Mortgage been talked about by consumers since the game? I think it's an awful lot. And that's a significant event in continuing to build their business, I would say.
It's one of the more efficient, and I know it sounds crazy, it's one of the more efficient buys in all of media.
Yeah, and here's one other example from my sandwich days. When we were talking about CPMs with some of the folks that owned the company, and they early on they had told me that their company philosophy was to be notoriously cheap, right? So I said, okay. And then obviously brought up the topic of being in the Super Bowl. And there was lots of gnashing of teeth, as one might imagine. but I pointed out that the CPM for the Super Bowl was actually lower than the CPM for a weeknight Florida Panthers hockey game in South Florida. So, from an efficiency standpoint, not even counting the additional exposure, to me, the decision was pretty clear, at least at that point in time.
I think the other thing is that, the options to get big reach are way down.
Right.
I mean, if you just look at the trend line of the highest rated series going back before I was born, was like I Love Lucy at 70. And then you'd have things like ER at 24. And now the highest rated series is Sunday Night Football at 11 or 12. And you don't have the other options. And then the Emmys way down too. That's like half of what it used to be, the Academy Awards, et cetera, et cetera. So you don't really have a chance to aggregate an audience this quickly and this efficiently.
Great. So why don't we switch to Daytona and Norris? I know that you're particularly close to NASCAR. So the unfortunate thing about the race, the 500 race, was that you had the big crash and then you had the weather problem, but then you had a much beloved up and coming driver kind of win the race. And then you had the phenomenon of being at Daytona for a second week where they configured the course like a road course. What did you see with that in terms of the brands that were there and what might have been different this year because of the pandemic, but also might have worked that they could, that may be something we see going forward?
Well, I think, for those that may not be familiar with NASCAR, it's important to realize that we just talked about the NFL Super Bowl. NASCAR starts its season with its own Super Bowl type event, its biggest event, the Daytona 500. So it does make sense that we're talking about both of them in a way today. And I think the other interesting thing leading into this year's Daytona, if you think about this past sports season in terms of viewership, with all of the disruption that COVID brought to sports, there were a lot of sports that were down in ratings season over season. And NASCAR actually bucked the trend. They were actually a little bit up. And the reason why is they were able to maintain probably the most regular, type season, if you will, other than the NFL, than many other sports. So it's pretty remarkable when you think about it compared to all of the other sports that suffered in ratings this past season. So take that going into this year's Daytona. I think there were really big expectations and excitement and hopes about what the race would do. And Dan can definitely talk about this too. They started the race with great ratings. I think they were up to 8 million peaking in the beginning of the race, which is a great start for them. And it matters a lot in terms of the end all viewership. Unfortunately, they had a rain delay and that hurt the ratings. So, that caused a little bit of disruption, but to your point, they had Michael McDowell won his first Cup race ever. And interestingly enough, immediately following that race, he struck a new sponsorship deal with carparts.com. So I think it's a great example of just, some success for that driver. But I just a couple other takeaways on what I think happened in Daytona. They were able to bring in 30,000 fans. It's one of the largest sporting events to occur since COVID. And I think some other interesting examples of what they did, which we're seeing across sports, is really using virtual and using virtual and iPhones to bring fans, even though they couldn't be there, to the track. And NASCAR has been very innovative, as a lot of other sports properties are doing right now, in using virtual to replace that in-fan, in-stadium experience. So, it's fascinating to watch this. To your point, the second week in, they had a road course. Unusual for them to go from Daytona to a road course. They have added more road courses to the season this year, based on the simple fact, and they put in a lot of research into this, that fans like road courses. And this is a really big change for them to add more road courses into the season. A bit of a gamble, a big change, but they're doing it smartly based on what the data says. So, the takeaway out of the race was the ratings did pretty well. Maybe not as well as what they would normally have in the second race of the season, but they did well. In fact, I think it was the highest rated road course race in the last 6 or 7 years. So that's a very good sign of things to come for NASCAR down the road. Dan,
thank you, Norris. So Dan, let me jump in and ask the question that we were kicking around a little bit, which is, to my eye, you have fewer of the big brands now sponsoring teams, but they seem to be very, very prominent in terms of the broadcast by buying ads and features in and around the ads. I mean, it seemed like, the last 10, 15 laps, each of the first 2 weeks, you had nothing but major brands being visible there. Are you seeing the same thing? And if you think that's a trend, why do you think it is?
Yeah, I do. And Norris, everything you said, right? It's exactly right. We're seeing and why we're so excited and bullish about NASCAR, not only for the rest of the season going forward, but really when you look back at last year, right? NASCAR was one of the best partners we had. And a lot of it was just because the sport was conducive to what the issues were, right? It's you have the driver that's, sort of contained within the car. And certainly there's teams and there's garages, so you have to work together, but you can social distance a little bit easier, a lot easier than some of the other sports. So they got back to racing, relatively quickly. There was nothing else that was happening. So fans started gravitating there. Before that even happened, right? I should have mentioned first, the iRacing simulation that we did with real drivers. So it wasn't esports, it was real drivers driving on real tracks through simulations. And that was really cool. And it brought new fans, younger fans, to at least get exposed to the sport and the drivers and how much fun it could be. So, Tony, to your question, though, in terms of now going forward, those brands that kind of, put their toe in the water a little bit last year, we're seeing them come back. There's still, the lion's share of the brands that are there are traditional NASCAR advertisers. Mm-hmm. Some of them NASCAR marketing partners too. But similar to what I've said a few times about the NFL and the Super Bowl is nowadays it's like, you don't have to be a marketing partner, right? You don't have to have your logo on the hood of a car in order to break through and to engage consumers, because the television broadcast is there, the social aspect through social media and all the extensions on digital, both while the race is going on, as well as coming out of the race, leading into the race. So the technology that exists for media consumption is something that I think is driving, let's call it again, that this word, I don't know if I should use the word efficient, but more efficient, lower out of pocket, let's call it that, for media in NASCAR versus the cost of doing business on the NASCAR side to be a hood sponsor has gone up tremendously because of technology as well, right? To run a race team, and this is, Norris can speak to this better than me, but to run a race team is really expensive to be competitive. That's why you continue to see sort of the haves and the have-nots. By the time you get into 6 or 7 races into the season, the guys that have the most money and have the most sophisticated garages, like they can compete, week in and week out on a different level. So brands are finding more ways to engage consumers with media alone, because I think the cost on the marketing side.
Great. So talking about teams, there's some new entrants in NASCAR, which all indications are may breathe some energy and enthusiasm into it. Michael Jordan, the great basketball player, has got a team, and Pitbull's got a team. Norris, you're close to the measurement side of the NASCAR business. What do you think those may yield in terms of audience growth and interest by sponsors and those in the marketing community?
I think so far interest by sponsors is top of the list. I mean, I think both teams are seeing that in terms of their sponsorships early on in the season. I think time will tell. I think the idea of these teams coming into the sport is a great move for NASCAR, obviously, in terms of their diversity efforts and what they're trying to do. I think a lot of it, though, will boil down to how they race on the track. I mean, you know, that's what fans want. NASCAR fans, they want a winner. And so I think if they can get a few wins on the books or get some top 10s, I think that will make a big difference. And I think a lot of people are bullish on their ability to do that. Particularly Michael Jordan's team with Bubba Wallace, who's a great driver, and you know, the funding and technology behind that race team.